going to be a video response to Dude for Reason's video entitled Creation Meets Philosophy Part 1, Knowledge, Justification, and Belief, wherein he describes three philosophical systems of justification in the subdivision of philosophy known as epistemology. Now I have a lot to say in a very little time, so I'm going to kind of focus on a main conclusion he derives at between 702 and 720, which states, "So to return to the issue of skepticism, yes, it is true that we can never be absolutely sure that our brain is able to interpret reality perfectly. The flip side is, based on a coherent picture painted by science and grounded in observational experience, we have reason to believe that our brain evolved to interpret reality successfully," end quote. I like to break this conclusion down into three sections, namely 1. Skepticism as any sort of justification theory, 2. Reliance on our sense experience, scientism, and coherentism as an adequate explanation as to why our brains interpret reality truthfully, and 3. Could we trust the interpretation of reality via a materialistic evolutionary process? My first point, which is more of a clarifier, involves knowledge skepticism as a system of justification. Knowledge skepticism would be synonymous with what was called philosophical skepticism. Now, honestly, I never really considered knowledge skepticism as any sort of justification theory, for the simple fact that skepticism is a very weak position. Now, more on that in a moment. While the conclusion that was drawn seems to reject strong forms of skepticism, it does seem to allow for a weaker form of this ideology. Specifically, the conclusion seems to allow for local skepticism. There is an allowance of certain types of knowledge, for example, like science, but not all forms of knowledge, like the certainty of our sense experience. I would quickly like to establish why I think skepticism is a weak position and why local skepticism should be rejected. First, skepticism is self-refuting. Consider the statement that was used at a minute 40. Quote, "The philosophical skeptic denies that it is possible to assert any truth claims." In other words, there are absolutely no grounds for believing anything, end quote. What makes this statement self-refuting is twofold. First, this statement in and of itself is a truth claim, and thus it would have to be rejected by its own standard. And second, the statement must be believed in order for it to be true, for someone to hold it. Thus, it is self-refuting. Second, Augustine is known to have held that even if one truth is known, then skepticism is refuted. Referentially, it would seem dubious even for a radical skeptic to deny that he or she exists, even in light of appeals that this is a dream world. For if they reject that they exist, then this is again guilty of self-refutation, since they would have to exist in order to assert that they did not. We could go on and list other faults of skepticism, for example, the criterion problem. But this was not the main tenet of the conclusion drawn by Dude for Reason, and thus this first point is to clarify the weakness of skepticism and the notion that our minds and brains cannot provide sure information about reality. This simply is not true. My second point and main point involves reliance on sense experience, coherentism, and scientism as adequate explanations as to how our brains and minds interpret reality around us. Now let me quickly break down these three areas and explain why I believe that they fail to provide an adequate explanatory scope for how our minds and brains interpret reality. Now first, let's consider sense experience. The conclusion states simultaneously that, quote, "Yes, it is true that we can never be absolutely sure that our brain is able to interpret reality perfectly," while stating, quote, "Based on a coherent picture painted by science and grounded in observational experience, we have reason to believe that our brain evolved to interpret reality successfully." Do you see the problem there? Right off the bat, we are encouraged to rely on sense experience to correctly modify our beliefs. Yet simultaneously, we are told that we can never be absolutely sure that our sense beliefs, i.e. what our brain is using to interpret reality, are accurate. Conservatively, this thesis seems to be diminishing in its explanatory scope when it states, "Rely on your sense beliefs that you can't fully trust to modify your beliefs." Second, let us quickly address the reliance on scientism, i.e. if something does not square with current scientific beliefs, then it is not true or rational. It would seem that strong forms of scientism are self-refuting, for strong scientism is not itself a proposition of science, but of philosophy, and thus would have to be rejected by its own standard. Second, scientism does not allow for the necessary presuppositions that science requires to function. In other words, science requires a number of facts in order to function. For example, mathematical truths, logical inference, trustworthiness of our sense of experience, the order of an external world, adequate language to refer to the external world, etc. And since none of these can be proven via science, they must be rejected if we're holding to scientism. Lastly, scientism cannot account for the rationally justified beliefs that all of us hold outside of science. For example, ethical truths. Example, it is wrong to torture babies. Aesthetic truths, X is beautiful, and metaphysical truths, there are other minds other than my own, are all models of rationally justified beliefs outside of the field of science. I would wager the dude for reason believes that he does not adhere to scientism. However, his language suggests that if something goes against evolutionary theory, then it should be rejected. Example, quote, is there any reason to believe that evolution is untrue? About as much reason as we live in a dream world right now, end quote. This statement is a form of scientism, and therefore, for the reasons listed above, scientism should be rejected. Third, let us address the reliance on coherentism as a model of justification. Unfortunately, Dude for Reason is mistaken in his description of coherentism as a system of justification. While there are several versions of coherentism, it is extremely important to note that no coherence theory of justification relies on experience or sensory beliefs as an outer web or ring that justifies the inner web of beliefs, as his diagrams would suggest. Rather, coherentism relies on the dosatic assumption, i.e. the sole factor that justifies a belief is another belief, meaning that there is one web or ring of beliefs that justify themselves. Thus, sensory experiences themselves do not ground or justify beliefs in a noetic structure. Rather, coherentism is looking at symmetry between beliefs. In other words, according to coherentism, a belief is justified for a person if a belief is a member of a coherent set of beliefs for that person. With this clarification, let's examine two issues with coherentism. First, coherence theories of justification suffer from brutal circularity. For example, belief A justifies belief B, which justifies belief C, which justifies belief A. However, since the basis correlation of justification is a lot like the causal relation, a belief cannot cause or be the basis of itself, nor, if we assume one belief, let's call it A, is the basis for another belief, let's call it belief B, then B cannot be the basis of itself, B. But this means that no belief can be the basis of itself in whole or in part. But this is exactly what coherentism requires, and thus is circular. Second, coherentism suffers from the isolation problem. Since coherentism states that justification is isolated from sense experience, then it would seem that this implies that coherentism cuts justification off from the external world and makes it exclusively internal. Yet, since the objective of justification is to provide knowledge of the external world and truth, such a theory that cuts justification off from such a thing seems inadequate. Thus, 1, in light of the self-refuting nature of skepticism, 2, the inadequate and self-refuting nature of scientism, and 3, the internalization of justification from the external world, then it follows that these three factors are not adequate models to justify belief, nor do they suggest the trustworthiness of our cognitive faculties. Third and final point, does a materialistic evolutionary process give us a reason to trust our brain's interpretation of reality around us? Consider the last statement. Quote, in the description of life provided by evolution, our brains have become tailored over time by natural selection to better understand our environment. Taking the evolutionary position gives us reason to trust our cognitive abilities, end quote. I would suggest that we should remain unconvinced of such an idea. Assuming evolution to be true, then our cognitive faculties were selected via survival value and not truth value. In other words, the ultimate purpose of our cognitive faculties is to guarantee adaptive behavior, but not true belief. Thus, we have no reason to suspect that evolution, quote, gives us reason to trust our cognitive abilities. Rather, evolution provides a defeater for trustworthy cognitive faculties, i.e., its ultimate care about behavior and not truth. Since I don't have time to develop this last point, in the description is a 3-video series by Veritas on Alvin Plantinga's argument from evolutionary naturalism. However, even without this brief third point, the problem with scientism, sense experience, and coherence theories of justification provide adequate defeaters for Dude for Reason's cumulative conclusion about our brain's interpretation of reality around us.